Shabbat Shalom. Of all of Isaac Mayer Wise's considerable gifts to consider on this, the week of his 200th birthday, perhaps his most legendary was his ability to take a right hook to the chin. The son of an impoverished Bohemian schoolmaster, Wise immigrated to America in 1846, where by the time of his passing in 1900, he would become the chief architect and dominant voice of American Reform Judaism, if not American Judaism as a whole. As historians tell it, Wise was a sort of Jewish Alexander Hamilton, an uncommon man possessing a manic self-confidence, able to express himself effectively in writing lectures and sermons, a more than able polemicist filled with boundless energy, political savvy, and a knack for controversy. Above all, Wise loved America, the freedoms it granted to Jews as a place to create a new brand of Judaism, unburdened by the state control and rabbinic hampering of the old world. Soon after his arrival, Wise was elected rabbi of Bethel Synagogue in Albany, where he introduced a series of reforms, including a mixed choir, confirmation ceremony, and hymns in English and German. Tensions spiked as Wise quarreled with the cantor Weiss Traub, who also served as a local butcher. Wise declared Traub's meat unkosher, having witnessed Traub visiting saloons, drinking, and playing cards. Things came to a head on September 6, 1850, 2 days before Rosh Hashanah, when Traub, together with the synagogue president Louis Spanier, informed Wise of the board decision that Wise was discharged of his rabbinic duties. In order to understand what happened next, you need to know that in those days in that synagogue, as still with some synagogues to this day, synagogue honors like opening the ark or being called to the Torah and otherwise were sold off. Unbeknownst to Spanier, Wise's supporters hatched a plan to purchase the honor of opening the ark on Rosh Hashanah morning. Wise arrived in synagogue on Rosh Hashanah that day in his rabbinic garb, and at the moment of Sulzer's Ein Kamocha, at that moment, he stepped onto the bima and approached the ark to remove the scrolls, and it was there and then that Spanier stepped up, stood in Wise's way, and cold-clocked the rabbi with his fist, knocking Wise's hat off of his head. A brawl broke out on the bima between the factions, which was quickly joined by members of the choir. Albany's sheriff was called in. The congregants spilled onto the streets. The synagogue doors were locked, and Wise was arraigned on that day of judgment before the not-so-heavenly municipal court. Unrepentant, on the following second day of Rosh Hashanah, Wise conducted services in his home with his supporters, the first service of what would become the breakaway congregation of Anshe Emet, to be led by Wise until he left for Cincinnati in 1954. Happy birthday, Rabbi Wise. It's a great story. The brawl on the bima, the slugfest of Yontif, a true tale from the frontier days of American Jewry. In retrospect, many say Wise had it coming. He was an opportunist with a penchant for self-aggrandizement. It was just a matter of time before someone would take him down a peg. Others, more sympathetically, note that just a few months prior, Wise had suffered the unimaginable, bearing his 2-year-old daughter Laura, a loss which left him understandably with a short fuse. Still others, with an eye for the inner workings of synagogue life, note that Wise was a man of ambition, who in the months prior was publicly offered, accepted, and then declined a position at a synagogue in Charleston, a flirtation that presumably left a bad taste in the mouth of many of his congregants, and I imagine his synagogue president. Given that Wise went on to found and lead the three major institutions of the Reform movement that continue to this day, the Umbrella Union for Reform Judaism, the Seminary for Reform Rabbis, Hebrew Union College, and the Union of Reform Rabbis, the CCAR, the Central Conference of American Rabbis, it's no wonder that this colorful incident continues to be studied and debated today. So when I picked up Stephen Weissman's new book, The Chosen Wars, How Judaism Became an American Religion, it wasn't surprising that this incident featured prominently. What was interesting, however, was a cause that Weissman tags as the instigating factor for the fisticuffs in Albany, Jewish theology, specifically the doctrine of the coming of the Messiah. Now, by way of background, Jews, you need to know, have long held the belief in the coming of the Messiah, a future era when the house of David will be restored to Jerusalem, the Jewish people return to Israel, and the nations of the world turning to Israel's God as the one true God. It's what we pray for in the Aleinu prayer, the Kedusha. It's a belief that the Talmud deems to be a litmus test for entry into the world to come. It's one of Maimonides' 13 essential principles of faith, Ani ma'amin be'emunah shlema be'viat HaMashiach, in the coming of the Messiah. It's a vision of which the prophet Ezekiel describes in this morning's Haftorah reading, a future redemption to mirror the Passover redemption. Most of all, it's a hope that has sustained our people in times of oppression, exile, and persecution throughout Jewish history. One day, we will return to the land, restored as a unique nation. There are, as with everything, exceptions, and some of the details, like how Israel's already clogged highways will handle the demographic challenge of thousands of years of Jews coming back to life. But it is fair to say that more or less, the Messianic idea sits at the very foundations of Jewish belief. But Wise didn't think so, and more significantly, was not afraid to say so. It was on that visit to Charleston that Wise, present in a debate on whether it was appropriate for Jews to still believe in the coming of Messiah to deliver them back to Palestine, publicly and dramatically denied and disavowed this principle of faith. As news of Wise's heresy spread, Spanier, the president of the Albany Synagogue, obtained an affidavit from 3 Orthodox leaders calling into question as to whether a rabbi who denied the Messiah was fit to serve a congregation. Spanier's objections were only hardened when members of the congregation called on Spanier to suspend Wise from his rabbinic duties until it could be ascertained whether Wise had, in fact, denied the Messiah. The investigation plodded on until that fateful synagogue board meeting 2 days before Rosh Hashanah, when Spanier submitted his report concluding that while undecided on charges of obstruction of justice, Wise was indeed in sufficient doctrinal breach, that was a joke, so as to be relieved of his rabbinic duties, all of which, according to Weissman, is a theological backdrop for the altercation to come. It's an interesting theory, thoroughly researched and well written by Weissman, but ultimately brings us back to the simple or not so simple question of so what, or who cares? So what if Wise did or didn't believe in the Messiah? Why would any theological issue, and this one in particular, divide a congregation and prompt such an unseemly incident to unfold? At first blush, the coming or the non-coming of the Messiah is hardly a matter of real-world implications. None of us are ever going to know for sure who's right. You believe in what you believe in, I'll believe in what I believe in. At the end of days, we'll have a good laugh about it. Why not just let well enough alone? The answer, I believe, is that at stake was not so much the promise of the Messiah, but the promise of America. Wise envisioned the growth of an American Judaism, a Minhag America in Hebrew, as his prayer book was called, reflecting a universally accepted religion, Wise doesn't fit neatly into a box. Yeah, he introduced synagogue music in the service, but he also was a protector of the Sabbath. He encouraged women's participation, but he opposed critical biblical scholarship. He was at times bold and innovative, and at times moderate and traditional. The power of his vision was that it was pinned to a denationalized Judaism in which Jews could exist proudly and confidently alongside their American brothers and sisters of other faith traditions. It was a vision that stood in sharp opposition to a belief in a personal Messiah, whereby Jews longed for a return to their national homeland. Wise couldn't believe in the Messiah, because if he did, then it meant that America was not home. It was under Wise that Judaism was transformed in America from a national identity tied to a land into a denationalized religious community, a proposition that altogether stood in contrast to traditionalists like Spanier and others. And for Wise, Albany was only the beginning. Wise may have been knocked on his back that day, but in the years to come, he would brush himself off, pick himself up, and then some. It was under Wise's leadership that the Reform movement would draft the Pittsburgh Platform, a document that would explicitly state that Reformed Jews, quote, consider ourselves no longer a nation, but a religious community, and therefore expect neither a return to Palestine nor the restoration of any of the laws concerning the Jewish state. It was Wise who, in the summer of 1897, the same summer when Herzl convened the Zionist Congress, as a leader of the Reform movement, Wise flatly rejected Zionism, explaining, quote, it can make no difference to us in what particular spot of the earth's surface we occupy. We want freedom, equality, justice, and equity to reign and govern the community in which we live. This we possess in America in such fullness that no state would ever improve on it. That new messianic movement, Zionism, Wise wrote, over the ocean does not concern us at all. For Reform Jews of Wise's era, America was their Zion. To be a Zionist, that was a retreat from the American dream. To hope long and pray for a messianic restoration of Palestine was to deny the promise of being a Jew in America. Now, a whole lot has changed since that fateful fight in Albany and since Wise passed away in 1900. With the arrival of the Balfour Declaration, the horrors of the Holocaust, and the establishment of the Jewish state, whatever anti-Zionism and non-Zionism was once espoused by the Reform movement has become altogether passé. For better and horrifically for worse, the argument for a Jewish state has become self-evident. Every Reform platform since Pittsburgh has become progressively more Zionist in its commitment to the state and land of Israel, and even most recently encouraging aliyah, emigration to Israel, a call to action that probably made Wise turn over in his grave. This past week, Hebrew Union College appointed a new president, Dr. Andrew Reffeld, a leader of impeccable credentials whose stature comes, amongst other things, from a stated and sustained commitment to Israel. Much has changed since Wise, for the Jews, for the world, and for the relationship between the Jews and the world. And yet, we would do well to ask if we as American Jews are not still asking the same questions as the Jews of Wise's era. You may or may not hope for the messianic redemption, but I imagine at your Seder table this month, you may just say, next year in Jerusalem. How many of us really mean it? Wise may have been wrong in his stance against Zionism, but his read of Judaism as a faith that seeks redemption by way of adherence to tradition and good works, but not by way of a longing for a return to Israel, is altogether prophetic. We need look no further than Israel's election just days away, an election in which none of us in this room will be voting, as proof positive that our identities as Jews have sidestepped the age-old hope to be restored to our homeland. All of us in this room, myself included, are heirs to Wise. Until and unless we prove otherwise, the truth is that it is America, not Israel, that is our Zion. It is a truth that Wise well understood and was willing to fight for. Depending on your wiring, it's a truth that lands softly without incident, or maybe like a sharp right hook to the jaw. It is a truth, nevertheless, that explains American Jewry, our relationship with Israel, and the challenges we face as world Jewry today. May we all be the wiser for it. Shabbat Shalom.